Hi, this is Vivian from Pharmasalon. Before you watch, I want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a CE credit for this video, go to the show notes below. There's a link to the Compounding CE website that will take you directly to the quiz for this class. The show notes also include the questions on the quiz, so be sure to check them out. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.
Hello, and thank you for joining. My name is Lee Rosebush, and I serve as the chair of the FDA practice as well as the pharmacy and reimbursement teams at BakerHostetler. And I also serve as the chair of the Outsourcing Facility Association, better known as the OFA. It is the trade association for 503B compounding facilities and outsourcing facilities. And with me, I have my colleague, Mark Wagner. We look forward to spending the next hour with you talking about inspection preparations and responses, particularly with a focus and an emphasis regarding FDA inspections. Mark?
Hi, my name is Mark Wagner, and as Lee mentioned, I'm an associate at Baker and Hostetler in the FDA practice group. And prior to entering law, I was a pharmacist, like many of you who are here today.
To start out, we have no conflicts of interest. However, I do want to mention again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do serve as the chair of the Outsourcing Facility Association of the OFA. And please know that any statements that I make today are not on behalf of the specific trade association, nor are they on behalf of any members. They are my own personal opinions as we move forward. We have three hopeful objectives that we hopefully are talking about today. First, we're hoping to discuss the similarities and differences between 503A and 503B inspections. Like many of you, we do handle and work with both 503A compounding pharmacies, better known as the traditional state licensed pharmacies, and 503B's outsourcing facilities. There are some similarities and differences that we're hoping to discuss today and go through specific differences, both from the FDA perspective, but as well as the differences between USP and CGMP. Second, we hope to identify resources to prepare for an FDA inspection. As I mentioned at the beginning, the emphasis today will be more on the FDA side of the inspection process as compared to state boards of pharmacy, and we are hoping to provide some specific resources and some useful information that can be helpful during an FDA inspection. And three, we're hoping to describe some of the best practices that we see in our practice as well as many of the facilities that we work with for inspection readiness.
Thanks for that introduction, Lee. Because our presentation focuses on what you can do before an FDA inspection or how to prepare for an inspection, the main piece of advice we can provide is to be proactive. And as Lee mentioned, we're going to compare and contrast the standards and differences between 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities. But that's really the fundamental elementary area where you can prepare prior to an inspection, is to know what standard applies to your facility. One standard that is applicable to both 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities is FDA's Insanitary Conditions at Compounding Facilities Guidance. This is a really useful resource that all compounders should review and ensure that they are not compounding under insanitary conditions. To begin, some of the basic differences between 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities is what standards apply. To start with, 503A compounding pharmacies are exempt from current good manufacturing practice requirements, labeling with adequate directions for use, and the new drug approval requirements. On the other hand, 503B outsourcing facilities are exempt from the requirement to label with adequate directions for use, new drug approval requirements, and drug supply chain security requirements. So you'll see outsourcing facilities must comply with current good manufacturing practices, whereas the standard that is mostly applicable to 503A compounding pharmacies is the USP 795 and 797 chapters and State Pharmacy Practice Acts. Another similarity and difference between 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities relates to what type of products or who they are compounding for. Typically, with limited exceptions, you'll see 503A compounding pharmacies primarily compound based on the receipt of a valid patient-specific prescription. 503B outsourcing facilities, on the other hand, may or may not obtain patient-specific prescriptions. There is no prohibition on 503B outsourcing facilities obtaining a prescription, but also it is not a requirement. So you'll typically see outsourcing facilities produce at larger batches on a not individual patient prescription scale. Another similarity and differences is the use of bulk drug substances. And this is also a hot topic or an area that FDA investigators or inspectors are sure to look at when inspecting either a 503A compounding pharmacy or a 503B outsourcing facility. This is an area that is really a difference of when a compounding pharmacy or an outsourcing facility can compound using bulk drug substances. Under Section 503A, so this is applicable to 503A compounding pharmacies, bulk drug substances must be accompanied by a valid certificate of analysis, or COA, and it must have been manufactured by an establishment that's registered with the FDA. This requirement when compounding from bulk drug substances is applicable to both 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities. The difference for bulk drug substance requirement really gets into the second point. And for 503A compounding pharmacies, bulk drug substances must comply with the applicable USP or National Formulary monograph if one exists. Or if one doesn't exist, the bulk drug substance must be a component of an FDA-approved drug. For 503B outsourcing facilities, the bulk drug substance must appear on a list that's developed by the FDA. That is known as the FDA 503B bulks list. It's currently under development. Or it must be on FDA's drug shortage list at the time of compounding, distribution, and dispensing. One important point to note, while the 503B bulks list is under development, the FDA does have an interim list of bulk drug substances that 503Bs may compound if the drug product appears on Category 1. Additionally, 503A compounding pharmacies can also compound when a bulk drug substance appears on the 503A bulks list. And there is also an interim list that is published by the FDA. Knowing these distinctions and also reviewing these interim lists for both 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities is one way you can prepare before an FDA inspection. Another similarity between 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities is the prohibition of compounding a drug that has been withdrawn or removed from the market for safety reasons. The FDA publishes this list, and it is available in the Code of Federal Regulations at Section 216.24. As part of being a prudent compounder, it's important to be familiar with this list and ensure that none of your compounded products appear on this list. That is surely one way that an FDA inspector would make an observation if a facility was compounding a drug that appeared on this list. Additionally, another list to be familiar with and monitor is the demonstrable difficulties list. Both 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities should not compound drug products that appear on the demonstrable difficulties list. Another prohibition that is applicable to both 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities is compounding drug products that are considered essentially copies of commercially available drug products. There is a fine distinction. For instance, 503A compounding pharmacies may not compound regularly or inordinate amounts of any drug products that are essentially copies of commercially available drug products. In 503B outsourcing facilities may not compound any drug products that are considered essentially a copy of a one or more approved drug product. The evaluation criteria that the FDA looks at when determining whether a compounded drug is essentially a copy of a commercially available drug product differs for 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities. And those differences and evaluation criteria can be found in FDA's applicable guidance documents. Interstate distribution limitations really only apply to 503A compounding pharmacies, and that is known, it's been a recent hot topic that's known as the Memorandum of Understanding, or the Compounding MOU. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we'll be giving another talk on the Compounding MOU. But to just give a brief intro on the Compounding MOU right now, 503A compounding pharmacies will be limited to interstate distribution of compounded drugs to no more than 5% if the drug compounder is located in a state that has not signed the MOU. Outsourcing facilities, on the other hand, the MOU specifically does not apply to outsourcing facilities. One prohibition that does not apply to 503A compounding pharmacies is the prohibition on wholesaling. There's no explicit condition under Section 503A. However, Section 503B does contain a prohibition on outsourcing facilities from wholesaling drug products. That's not to say that there are questions in the industry as to what is considered wholesaling and whether or not a drug may be further dispensed or distributed after it has been compounded in an outsourcing facility. And this is one area where guidance is forthcoming from the agency to better define the prohibition on wholesaling and provide guidance on what type of activities further distributors may do with 503B compounded products. As many of you are likely aware, 503B outsourcing facilities must register with the FDA and also provide product reports, or what is commonly known as listing their products. These products are not listed in the NDC directory. However, there is a 503B outsourcing facility product report database that is maintained by the FDA. Compounding pharmacies, on the other hand, do not have to register, reports, or list any products with the FDA. And lastly, two topics I wanted to make sure to highlight were adverse event reporting and labeling, specifically for 503B outsourcing facilities. Outsourcing facilities must submit adverse event reports to the FDA in accordance with the content and format requirements established through guidance or regulation. The FDA does have a final guidance on 503B adverse event reporting, and adverse event reporting is one area that we are seeing FDA investigators or inspectors increasingly make observations on. Before you receive an FDA inspection, you should definitely review your policies and procedures relating to adverse event reporting and make sure they coincide or align with FDA's final guidance on 503B adverse event reporting. Additionally, another area that we see FDA investigators and inspectors make observations at an increasing rate are labeling requirements for 503B compounded products. The statute of Section 503B specifically outlines the data elements that must appear on a 503B compounded product. Specifically, the statement, "This is a compounded drug," must appear on the label. Reviewing your labels and making sure they contain all of the information that is outlined in Section 503B is one way you can proactively prepare for an FDA inspection. As we mentioned earlier, the FDA guidance on insanitary conditions at compounding facilities is one standard that's applicable to both compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities. I'm not going to insult your intelligence and review all of these written, rather gross and disgusting conditions that have been found in compounding facilities or outsourcing facilities, but it is imperative that you do a walkthrough before any FDA inspection to ensure that these types of conditions do not occur at your facility. Specifically in guidance, the FDA has recommended the recall or the immediate recall of any drug that's compounded where there might be vermin or other animals, visible microbial growth, or unsealed or loose sealing tiles. Again, these are all conditions that are considered insanitary and can easily be spotted through a pre-walkthrough before any FDA inspection occurs.
Thank you so much for really going over the differences between 503As and outsourcing facilities. I think it's really helpful to revisit the basics all the time. I'm wondering if you have any real-world examples that you can tell us about. I think it's always interesting to hear stuff that you've actually seen. For example, I'd love to see who actually sees mice running around their place while the inspector's there.
Well, thank you. It is interesting. Some of these common observations that we've seen in the insanitary conditions are real-life examples, which is scary. If you went to some of the early on FDA listening sessions and scare sessions, I like to call them, that happened at the very beginning, 2013-14 time period, when the 503B industry was starting up and the DQSA was in its infancy, they actually had some pictures. I can remember one explicitly where there actually was a pet dog, literally sitting next to the person as they were doing sterile compounding, and didn't have on long leg pants, so they had a completely exposed skin, sandals on, and their pet animal sitting next to them as they were compounding drugs that were going to be injected. So there's a lot of the materials, scarily, do come from real life examples in that insanitary conditions. But the honest moving forward here is we as a compounding industry have come a long, long way in the last 6 or 7 years. One of the things that we often talk about is from the association's perspective, is just on the 503B side. The initial conversations and communications had to do an awful lot with safety, right? The comments oftentimes were sterile was safer than bulk compounding, for example, and finished drugs are safer than compounded drugs. Where now, when you listen to a lot of the conversations and communications, you don't hear those same comments being made. Really, a lot of the comments now relate to essential copy and the protection of the NDA and ANA process. And I think that speaks wholeheartedly and 100% to the fact that many in our industry have pushed hard for compounding and compliance and safety natures. And it shows just how far our industry has come, both on the A and the B side, in the last 5, 6, 7 years at this point.
I know that we've been talking a lot about, or I've been hearing a lot about the bias of the FDA against compounding pharmacies. So I'm wondering, one, is this both, do you see that bias against both 503Bs and 503As? And you talk about having come a long way. And I mean, certainly from my perspective, it seems like there's a huge difference over the last 10 years. Is FDA acknowledging that, do you think?
I do. Actually, September 14th and 15th, right? So it's not too long ago. The FDA actually had a Center of Quality Compounding Excellence presentation that lasted a couple of days. And in doing so, they actually mentioned several times the importance of compounding And if you look at the statements from Dr. Gottlieb, Acting Commissioner Dr. Woodcock, and the last few that we have seen from the last administration, they all acknowledge the importance of compounding. And I think, especially during the COVID period of time, though the drug shortages that happened with those, especially those products that were used to treat COVID, it's been interesting to see how the perceptions and the interactions with us in the 503As and 503Bs in our compounding industry have changed, right? Initially, if you go back to 2019, pre-COVID, it was more adversarial. And I'm not going to say every interaction was adversarial, but it was more of an adversarial overall from an interaction perspective, where now I think providers, those on the GPO and the purchasing side, and even those in our industry now understand the extreme importance that compounding facilities are there. One, that they can provide the individualized patient medicines, but two, that they can help resolve things like these drug shortages and turn on a much more of a dime as compared to the Titanic type of turn you see from pharma, which may take months to years to change a product line, where 503Bs are able to help turn much quicker to help resolve some of these drug shortages. And I think that has helped dramatically the interactions and the impressions of the agency, as well as those up on Capitol Hill about our industry in general. Mark, you've got thoughts?
Yeah, what you said about pharma being almost like a Titanic turn, they cannot just turn on a dime. I think you explained that really nicely, and we're going to talk about in a couple slides. But really just how much more nimble and flexible outsourcing facilities and compounders are in general. Compounders are almost able to just turn the switch on overnight to begin producing drugs, and outsourcing facilities, because they must comply with current good manufacturing practices, it takes a little bit longer, but they are still much more nimble than your traditional institutional pharmaceutical manufacturer. And when drugs are in shortage, patients, providers, the general public just doesn't have that type of time to wait. We see drug shortages last for years, and we know that there are adverse events associated with drug shortages. So being able to get more access, increase patient access, and increase the drugs that compounders and outsourcing facilities may compound before they might be recognized as an FDA drug shortage would really benefit the public and patient health at large.
I agree, right? And it's not necessarily patting our industry on the back, but I would say that nimbleness and flexibility and the ability to help resolve ideas around drug shortages and being able to move much more quickly in pharma, I think is one of the foresights for those that drafted the statute of the DQSA. Because as many know, we're one of the very few industries the FDA has explicitly carved out to help resolve drug shortages, and explicitly gave some of those exemptions. For example, the idea of the essential copy provisions don't apply when a drug is on a drug shortage to help resolve a shortage product, where we actually are meant by statute to help resolve that. And I think some of that quickness, nimbleness, flexibility, however you'd like to phrase it, is some of that foresight that was drafted up by the Hill to help us in those specific needs. And I think that is where, interestingly, over the last year or so, where we have seen the most interaction by the agency, and finally, I think after 7 or 8 years, the understanding and the importance of our industry to be able to help resolve some of these drug shortages in times like this.
Okay, great. Thanks. Now I'll let you move on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for going over some of the differences between 503A and 503B, both from a guidance as well as the statutory and legal authority behind some of those differences. One of the things that I'm hoping to do now over the next few slides is actually dive into some of the Form 483s that we often see relating to both 503A and 503B, but I will pull out specific regulations when it is on the B side, just because of the nature of trying to tie it to CGMP regulations that are similar to drug manufacturing register rates. Those are those in 21 CFR. For those that are newer to our industry, a Form 483 is the issuance of the FDA's observations after an inspection. Now, in this situation, not every inspection ends in a 483. If you have a clean inspection or no observations made, you may not get a 483. But unfortunately, in our industry, most facilities have a 483 just because it is nature of the FDA inspections and what they're observing. I would like to point out that when you receive a 483, it explicitly says up on the top that it isn't necessarily a direct violation of law, and it isn't an end-all be-all. This is simply something that was observed by the inspector during an inspection. And so one of the things that I would highly point to is that if you do receive a 483 through your compounding facility, whether it be a 503A or 503B, you do take a moment to take a look at that language that is on the Form 43 explicitly, as well as discuss the meaning of that with your inspector during the closeout of your inspection. Now, what we have tried to do is break down the top 10 most common observations in Form 483s that we have seen in the compounding industry. One being the most explicit, labels. And as you heard from Mark a minute ago, there are explicit requirements for 503B, something as simple as the statement as this is a compounded drug, or including the FDA's phone number as well as the website for adverse event reporting, which are requirements under Section 503B, and something that we would highly recommend that you review as you develop your labels or develop additional SKUs for your products to ensure that those are met. One of the questions that we often get is there an exemption, or could we use something that's similar language? Because in the FDA guidance, they say we will accept the language that they provide or a similar type of statement. Before any similar type of statement is used, we would highly recommend that you have that conversation with the agency to ensure that the agency signs off on your similar or differencing language, because we have seen things as simple as I mentioned a minute ago, the statement, this is a compounded drug, being different than that statement, and ultimately ending up in a 483 observation. Now, the problem with that is once you receive a 483 observation, as many of you know, that has to be reported to state boards of pharmacy. And so the idea is obviously, while it's 483 is not an end-all be-all, nor is it necessarily legal aspects of it, it's an observation as described a minute ago. The state boards don't necessarily take it that way. So please, follow the guidance documents, particularly in these areas, and please pay attention to these areas. As I mentioned before, these are the 10 common most areas that are cited in Form 43s. Number 2, procedures are designed to prevent microbiological contamination of drug products or to be sterile are not established and written. Now, we often get the question of, wow, that's an awful lot of legalese. What does that truly mean? We're going to go into that here in a minute into much more detail. The key is to make sure that whatever is your process, that you have that written down in your SOP. And if your SOP says it, you need to do it. One of the questions that we often get is does our SOP have to abide by the guidance documents to the T? And I would say you can have additional requirements in your SOPs. Your SOPs can actually be stricter than what is required by FDA guidance or FDA regulations. But if you don't follow that, even though it's stricter than, you can still be cited for a 43 observation because you're not following your own SOPs. So I would highly recommend that somebody from your compliance and your quality program, sit down with your SOPs and sit down with your operations folks and actually watch a product come in through the door, as an API or finished sterile product to begin with. Actually see it being checked in, actually going through the compounding process, cleaning, etc. Actually making it through the product, actually following and marking some for testing, etc., going all the way through the end, labeling, storage and quarantine, and then actually an order, pick, and a ship to ensure that your process is what you say it is in your SOP and that it is being followed to the T. Because as I mentioned before, even if you're stricter than what the requirements are, you may meet the regulations, but miss meeting your SOP and still get cited for a 43 observation, even though you're above and beyond what would be legally required. 3, aseptic processing areas are deficient regarding the systems for monitoring environmental conditions. This really is your EM program, and we'll get into some of the regulations here more in a minute. 4, aseptic processing areas are deficient regarding the systems for cleaning and disinfecting the equipment to produce aseptic conditions. Now, one of the things that we would point to here is the cleaning agents themselves or the labeling for your equipment. Both of those likely would have recommended cleaning agents if it's for your equipment, Or 2, if it's for the cleaning agents themselves, recommended standing time. In other words, if you spray it on, it has to sit for 15 seconds, 15 minutes, whatever that timing would be. We often get the question to say, well, the label says it needs to be sitting on the table after a spray, for example, if you're disinfecting a table, for 15 minutes. But we know based on literature that it's really 10 minutes. Therefore, can we really just do 10 and be done with it? And if you're in violation, as I mentioned a minute ago, as to what the labeling aspects of it could be, you very well could be cited for 43 observation, even though the product may be clean after 10 minutes. It's important to remember that if you're going to make those types of changes, for example, anything that would be different from a cleaning agent or anything that would be different for your equipment, that's what's on the label itself, that you have the scientific information to 1, verify it, 2, ensure that it's actually being met, and 3, that your SOPs are actually saying that you're not just following the labels, but you're actually following a specific procedure or process. Before any of this could actually be changed internally, I would highly recommend that you have all 3 of those types of conversations and discussions to ensure that you have the necessary information before any deviations from that would be made and documented in your SOPs. Otherwise, the agency hits hard on that particular observation. 5, the responsibilities and procedures applicable to the quality control unit are not in writing and fully followed. One of the things that you will see as you delve into our industry a little bit more is the extreme importance of the QC unit, or the QA, depending on how you phrase it in your company. The quality unit is arguably one of, if not the most important unit in a 503B facility. The reason being is without the ability to ensure that the products are safe, we could put a lot of patients at risk. And accordingly, it's important to ensure that the QC methods are being followed and that they're being documented properly. 6, there's a failure to thoroughly review any unexplained discrepancies in the failure of a batch or any of its components to meet any of its specifications, whether or not the batch has already been distributed. It's important to remember that if you have a deviation, if you have an error, if you have an adverse event, if you have something that has to occur, it's important to remember that you have to follow up on that. It doesn't necessarily mean that a corrective action has to be done, right? It depends on what the issue is. For example, it may be that somebody received, they say 9 instead of 10, and you can't necessarily document whether they had 9 or 10. And so there isn't necessarily a corrective action other than ensuring the counting is done properly, for example. But any issue that is reported back to you, to ensure that it is followed up on properly and that you go through the deviation process. Now, the FDA, for the record, is somebody who's been through literally over 100, closer to 200 FDA inspections at this point on both the 503A and the 503B side. I can tell you directly with firsthand knowledge, the FDA is not going to hammer you because you have a deviation. The issue becomes is if you're not following up on those deviations, you're not documenting it properly, you're not inspecting it properly, and you're not ensuring that it wouldn't be done again. That is the key. The FDA will inspects most of the 503As and 503Bs to have some sort of deviation, etc., in their materials. And in fact, we'll actually ask you if you don't have something documented as a deviation, why you don't, because it is suspicious at that point if you don't have anything documented, because human nature errors happen. It's just a matter of time somewhere along the ways. 7, laboratory controls do not include the establishment of scientifically sound and appropriate specifications and test procedures designed to assure that the components conform to the appropriate standards of identity, strength, quality, and purity. There's a lot of legalese to simply say that you are having a lab test to ensure that the product is what you say it is. In other words, that you have the identity down, the strength, the quality, and the purity of your product. So if you say, for example, that it's a morphine 100 milligrams, it is morphine at 100 milligrams, and there is an additional materials inside of that product. You have done the stability, potency, quality testing associated with that. 8, equipment and utensils are not cleaned, maintained, and sanitized at appropriate intervals. As I mentioned above, if you have a policy, you need to ensure that the policy is followed. If you have cleaning agents, you need to ensure their cleaning agents are done. You need to ensure that the cleaning is done on a regular basis. 9, aseptic processing areas are deficient regarding systems for maintaining any equipment used to control the aseptic conditions. Make ssure that all of your equipment is validated and cleaned properly. And 10, Testing and release of drug products for distribution do not include appropriate laboratory determination of satisfactory conformance to the final specifications and identity and strength of each active ingredient prior to release. Now, there have been some questions on this one, particularly for those that compound from finished product. In other words, if you have product that has come from an FDA drug manufacturer that is approved, and they have an FDA approved label, and you're simply repackaging or you combine that with another product, you would assume the product, if done correctly, would have the product you say it has in it. There's still been some questions as to whether or not you have to do the laboratory testing. I would highly recommend in this situation that you do the laboratory testing associated with that, whether it be identity, strength, etc., moving forward, regardless of whether or not you're on potency. Whether or not you're from finished product or whether or not you're from bulk product. Next slide. Now, we've gone through those 10. What I've tried to do here is actually pull, particularly for the 503B space, the 21 CFR regulations. So you'll see here for the labeling, which was our number one and the most specifically named observation in 503A and 503B inspections. We've tried to give the citations to it, as well as the draft guidance provisions that you could find that. So specifically for labeling, I would point to 21 CFR 211, and specifically point 122, 125, 130, and 134. In addition, I would point to the CGMP practice guidance document. For us, we've tried to narrow this down to what we call red flags at Baker, right? These are the areas that are, oh gosh, right? This is, if you see this, the FDA is no doubt going to give you an observation. It doesn't mean that there's another additional issues. As I mentioned, the word of, like, this is a compounded drug, for example. So I don't want to make it sound like these are the only things you need to focus on, but these are the most common errors inside of the most common observation, which is the labeling observation. And the red flags for labeling include product containers not labeled immediately, and 2, multiple products compounded in one cleaning room with no segregation. Notice that isn't necessarily the language that I just mentioned a minute ago. This is a compounded drug, the FDA website, the FDA phone number. People who have been around the industry long enough now know that those are requirements and that needs to be there. So what we are seeing now on a trending basis are those 2 specific issues, particularly for those that pool. So you will pool bag and then try and put that into a different final container. As you can see here, if the product is not labeled immediately, that is one of the big no-nos from the FDA's perspective to ensure that labeling is done immediately. And then 2, when you have multiple products being done in a situation, right, the potential for cross-contamination is a big concern from FDA. And we've tried to pull the legal citation, as you see there on the bottom, 503B A10, for those who want to dig into the statute. Next slide. The next one that we had talked about was procedures specifically designed to prevent microbiological contamination. And again, here, as I mentioned a minute ago, the CFR citations. These CFR citations that we would point to, again, are 21 CFR 211, which again are the drug CGMPs, and it's specifically 0.22, 0.180, 0.192, 0.198, and as I mentioned a minute ago, specifically for 0.22, the fact that the FDA requires that drug products producers establish a quality control unit to oversee various aspects of production. Right, as I mentioned a minute ago, the most important, if not the most important specifically, is the quality control unit in a 503B. And you can see here in the 21 CFR citation that requirement for a QC unit, specifically and what some of their activities must be. As I mentioned a minute ago, our red flags and what they mean. Our red flags specifically in this area is the inadequate smoke study. Well, this has been something that's been going around for 7 or 8 years now, the entire length of our industry. We have seen this observation come up multiple times. It is still coming up. And so we would raise this here as specifically, not necessarily the lack of a smoke study, because people know they have to be done now, but an inadequate smoke study. Specifically, it must be videoed, and it must be in a situation under dynamic conditions. The other areas that we will see, particularly the smoke study itself did not demonstrate unidirectional airflow, or it did not cover the entire length and height of the HEPA filter itself. Next. The third observation, as we mentioned, was aseptic processing areas. This one is 21 CFR 211.42, 0.46, and 0.58. And our red flags specifically on aseptic processing include the lack of air control systems. One of the big concerns that came out of NECC, we had mold in one area, particularly in one corner, and it spread throughout the facility. It spreads throughout the facility, not necessarily by touch. It spreads because the spores get in the air, and it's still something the FDA considers highly important, whether it be in CGMP space for a CMO, pharma, 503B, or whatnot. They still consider that air control system as one of the most important. And two, in this area, was the influx of poor quality air into a higher classified air. So in this situation, make sure that your airflows go in the proper direction with negative and positive airflows to ensure that the ISO 5 areas are protected from the ISO 6s, protected from the ISO 7s or 8s, etc., moving down the class system. Next slide. In this situation, specifically for the aseptic processing areas regarding cleaning and disinfecting, it's 21 CFR 211 again, 0.42, 0.56, and 0.67. In addition, it's at the CGMP draft guidance at page 7. And the big red area in this area is the use of non-sterile disinfectants in ISO 5 areas. And the reason why that is so important, right? We often get the questions, well, we're doing the cleaning and our cleaning requires X based on our manuals, whether it be from the tables, whether it be from the chairs, etc. And it's important to remember anything that you would introduce into the sterile ISO 5 area has the potential possibility of contaminating your room, even if it is a cleaning agent. So ensure in the situation that you have the proper disinfectants being used in your ISO 5 area. Next slide. This observation specifically relates to the responsibilities and procedures applicable to the QC unit. And as I mentioned before, please make sure that the SOPs are completely written and fully followed, even if they are stricter than what is specifically required by law or regulation. In this situation, the CFR citation that we would point to, again, is 211. You're starting to see a trend, I'm sure. 21 CFR 211 is one of the most important for CGMPs. It's 21 CFR 211.22D, and the draft guidance is at page 4. Specifically, our red flags for this area. The 2 red flags include 1, failure to investigate and prevent distribution of products that did not pass sterility testing. So as you can see in the situation, it's a hit at both the QC area. In addition, it's a hit at the lab testing, and it's a hit, as I mentioned at the very, very beginning here, at our discussions on the observations, the importance of following up on anything that you would find that would be a deviation. In this situation, the deviation, the failure of the sterility testing, right? You could say that's above and beyond a standard deviation. It's a failure of a test, but we'll bucket that just for the deviations bucket, right? So it really does hit all 3. The second red flag in the situation is the QC unit failed to review and approve production records for sterility, method validation, aseptic processing, stimulation, or cleaning logs. Why is that important? Well, one of the questions we often get, especially when a 503B is starting up, transferring facilities, or after a shutdown, for example, is, well, we had all of our materials validated, so we're good to go, right? And it's important to remember that even after a shutdown, whether it be for 6 months, a year, a thorough cleaning, new equipment, whatever that would be, and you have to revalidate your equipment, your QC unit still needs to come in and sign off on all of that. Make sure, right, from the method validation, whether for testing, but also for all your validation of all your equipment, that you've had your QC unit sign off on all the materials. In addition, make sure they're signing off on all of the sterility testing or any testing in reality, not just the lab, but your QC unit also needs to sign off on that, because that is another area that we often see. And then the cleaning logs, right? It's not enough just to have whoever's in charge of your operations ensure the cleaning is being done, but the QC unit is checking off that the cleaning was followed and that the SOPs were done properly. Next slide. This observation is there's a failure to thoroughly review any unexplained discrepancies. As you can start to see a little bit of a trend here, as we mentioned before, any unexplained discrepancy must be investigated. And a discrepancy in the situation could be as serious as I mentioned a minute ago, a failure of a sterility test, up to the innocent of the gloves weren't necessarily put out properly. Make sure any discrepancy is followed up with and investigated. and closed out afterwards. Specifically, the appropriate specifications must be established for each drug product that is labeled in 21 CFR 211.160B and the draft guidance at page 22. As I mentioned before, this is again one of the most frequent observations and one that is ensured the FDA will follow up on because they will explicitly ask for your discrepancy logs during their FDA inspection. Next slide. The laboratory controls do not include the establishment of scientifically sound and appropriate specifications. Again, here's 21 CFR 211.160B, as well as the CGMP draft guidance at 14. I would also point to the ICH guidance for this one, specifically Q6A. Next slide. For this one, equipment and utensils are not cleaned, maintained, and sanitized at appropriate intervals. Again, 21 CFR 211 comes into play here, specifically in the situation 21 CFR 211.56. 0.56 requires that procedures be established and followed that assign responsibility for cleaning and give the cleaning schedules, methods, equipment, and materials that used and how they must be cleaned. That's why, again, it's extremely important. It's not just who's in charge of your cleaning or your operations who need to check off on this. Your EM person and your QC team need to be involved with this as well and signing off that this is occurring every single day. I would highly point to, in this situation, the CGMP draft guidance at page 7. In addition to 0.56, I would also point to 21 CFR 211.67. As you'll see here, both of them really relate to the equipment services themselves, and the equipment services themselves must be properly cleaned. Again, this goes to the labeling that we talked about a minute ago, that if the contact surface must be in contact with the cleaning agent for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it is, make sure that it is done properly. The other thing here, we often get the question of what and how do we validate our cleaning process and how do we document that? It is one of the things to ensure that if you are going to work in the QC unit of one of these 503Bs, that you go above and beyond in your research and reviewing the labeling of your cleaning agents to ensure that they have the ability to clean whatever the microbiology concerns are of your environment. It would include things like listeria, mold, etc., going down for that fungi. Make sure that you're using the proper cleaning agents. Make sure that the labels ensure that there's crossover and overlap between the cleaning agents for those that are of highly concern, particularly if you have a find of some sort of microbiology agent inside of your facility, and make sure that it's properly documented. So in other words, pull that research, put it in your master file, so that way when the FDA comes in and they ask you, why are you using a specific sporocyte, you can show them the research to say, this is why, because we have overlap. We have a concern with particular microbiology at the very beginning of our facility. We've now used the correct cleaning agents, right, and we've validated our cleaning process to ensure that it touches the contact surface for the proper period of time and that our cleaning procedures are being followed. Next slide. The aseptic processing areas are deficient regarding systems for maintaining any equipment used to control the conditions. In this situation, we would again point to 21 CFR 211 again, and specifically 211.68, as well as the draft guidance at page 12. And it's important to remember this is all equipment, even things as simple as spatulas, right? Make sure that in this situation, that anything that you would use is necessary and has the proper cleaning to ensure that it's done properly. Things that we often see with the red flags, you can see this one is a hot area of recent. And so there's 5 red flags that are of concern that we have seen in recent observations. Specifically, the software is not qualified, software is not password protected, which we often see for both of those for software that comes to buy off the shelf, people are concerned about, or if you develop a specific software just to meet a certain procedure, make sure that it's validated, that nobody else can get in, and that there's change controls, for example, in place, protection. So there's a password protected that if you can track who would make a change, who would document what, etc. In addition, one of the concerns is that quality staff have overwriting of saved data. As I mentioned a minute ago, there really shouldn't be changing of any data, period. If the quality control unit has a reason to put in a note, for example, that is fine. just make sure that it's documented properly and that the original data is not overwritten. It's just explained with a note as to why, and then the proper procedure is followed. Next, make sure that there's audit trail provisions, as I mentioned a minute ago. So if there is a change, you can show that change, how it was done, or if there were notes made, how those notes were made, when those notes were made, etc. And to ensure that there's sufficient controls over data and software used during production, which again is something that you would think, the formula should be there. It should be as simple as clean notes, etc., and how products are made. Make sure that those changes can be made. I can give you one example of a concern without mentioning a specific facility, but there was concerns that somebody could go in and change a formula, and if they went in and changed a formula, the formula is no longer validated for obvious reasons, because if a specific facility may have wanted a tweak change, for example, a flavoring change, and now that's a different flavoring, a different formula, not validated, could be done during the production facility and nobody else would know about it, even though it's gone through the QC test, etc. Even because in that situation, your testing may not necessarily pick up on the flavoring agent. Those are the types of concerns that the agency are really going to be looking for moving forward. So ensure that you have the proper password protections and change controls in place for any formula change or any documented change in all of your specific areas of QC and operations. Next slide. Testing. Testing has always been of importance, always will be of importance, and it will be of extreme importance even as of today. 21 CFR 211, again, 0.165 and 0.167 require that finished drug products be tested to determine whether they meet final product specifications. In other words, if you say it's something, you want to have testing to show that it is what you say it is. In addition, 21 CFR 0.22 establishes that the QC unit is responsible for ensuring the product is not released until the testing is conducted and the results confirm the finished drug product meets specifications. It's also in draft guidance at page 22. Again, that is why it's so important. At the very beginning, we mentioned the QC team needs to make sure that they're signing off. It's not just a lab who is signing off before release of the product. Next slide. So I know that was an awful lot of area. We wanted to make sure that we hit the 5 critical areas. When considering a 503B, what areas do I really need to be concerned with when you're developing these process and pathways? When we say it's these. The EM, that's the facility, the process, how it's made, assurances, and using finished product. Why? That those are really, in the eyes of many in the industry, the 5 building blocks of CGMPs. You want to make sure, 1, the facility is clean and proper. 2, that the process being used is aseptic, it's clean, and it's been validated. 3, that the product that you're making, even though the formulation may be good and the product going in is good, you want to make sure that the process actually making the product is good as well. And even though we're sure that the product process is good, the material going in is good, we want to test on the back end to assure our product is safe. And then once we have our product, we want to make sure that people understand what is in that product. Obviously, especially with those that are IV solutions or injectable solutions, they all look the same. So we want to make sure that the product is labeled properly and that they know when the expiration dates are. I would also point to, if a prescriber were to be held responsible, these are the 5 obvious areas associated with products liability claims. In other words, if something were to happen with your products, God forbid we had another NECC, these are the 5 areas that a plaintiff's attorney is going to look at. These are also the 5 areas that if you have a customer who complains about your product, whether it be a hospital or clinic, these are the 5 areas they're going to point towards. Make sure from a liability perspective and an insurance side, these are covered as well. This goes above and beyond just an FDA inspection. And as you've seen now with our observations review, these are the explicit areas that are called out by the FDA. With that, is there any questions?
Haley, thanks. That's a lot of information, a lot of great detail. What do you think are the main takeaways for our audience on inspections and knowledge? And second part of that question is, where should they focus their time and resources if they're limited in the real world?
You know, we often get asked that question about the real world. Let's be honest. Not everybody has the war chest of a $4 million, $1 billion right company, and you know, most of us as a 503B space don't have quality units that are 50 to 100 people. Accordingly, we all have limited resources and time. I honestly would say taking those 10 areas that we just talked about at a very high level and breaking them down are of extreme importance. That's not to say that there aren't things that go outside of this. Please don't say that these are the only 10 things I have to worry about. But from a real world experience, those are the 10 areas that I would spend my resources. Making sure my label is correct and addresses those in the FDA guidance. Fairly simple idea. But also it's important to make sure we have the least amount of observations in a 43. And so I would say, look, that is something that could be done fairly quick and easily. A lot of this other materials, whether it be processes, SOPs, whether it's about the facility, really comes down to at the very beginning, right? Was your process in your facility set up properly at the very beginning? Or are we really playing catch up? And if we're playing catch up, what do we really need to do to ensure that we meet those standards and requirements? A lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but I would say it's of extreme importance that if you haven't done already, you get a mock inspection and you say, okay, this is where we stand and where can we move forward in those particular areas of interest. Make sure you've got a good lab, whether it be internal or external, and make sure that your processes are being documented and followed. One of the easiest things that we often catch when we do mock inspections for folks is your SOP says X, but you're not doing X, you're doing Y. Why? And a lot of people will say, well, it's because it's easier to do it this way, or this is the real way that it should be done, or this is helpful, it's cleaner, it's easier, this is the sterile way to do this. And oftentimes they're correct. But as I mentioned a minute ago, it's because they're correct. If your SOPs say something and you're not following your SOPs, doesn't mean you're not going to be given a 43 observation. So make sure that you've taken that time, whether it be with somebody external, whether you just do it internally, to actually sit down, follow your SOP, and to make sure that you're following it to the T. Mark, thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I think those real-world examples are extremely helpful. I view it almost like past 483 observations are kind of like Tom Brady's game film. You need to study the past 483 observations in order to improve, because instead of just losing a game or getting a bad FDA inspection, the consequences here could be patient safety. So it's extremely valuable to study the past common 483 observations before an inspection, not only to prepare for inspection, but also just improve your processes and the compounding industry, as well as securing patient safety.
Okay, great, thanks. Lee, you mentioned processes, and I'm wondering, and you may be about to cover this, but what are some of the logistical things that should be going on getting ready for the inspection? And I might be treading on Rachel's ground with this question, because I heard a lot of talk about war rooms and the books and the designated person who stays with the inspector. Is that something that you guys have some advice on, or are you about to cover that?
It's funny because I'm going to turn it over to Mark to follow through with most of that area specifically. Okay. But one of the areas that I would point to very quickly is, as you just mentioned, it's of extreme importance to ensure that if FDA comes to do an inspection, they're not there as an enemy, right? To make sure that we interact with them properly and that we bring them the materials that they are asking for and we interact with the agency properly. But two, to make sure that they don't have free reign of our facility. It's still your facility. You still have control over your facility. You have to ensure that they, for example, follow your processes and procedures for gowning, that they follow the processes and procedures for going into any clean room, for example, or follow your processes and procedures for removing documents. Those are all important areas that once you start to go through these inspections, whether it be through an FDA inspection or a state board of pharmacy inspection, that you ensure are followed regardless of whether or not it's an inspector or somebody coming in from the outside or one of your employees.
Okay, great. Well, then I guess, Mark, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be getting to those topics shortly. Just before we get there, like we talked about earlier, how nimble or flexible, whatever term you want to use to talk about compounders and outsourcing facilities. Some real life examples again, where we've just seen these over the past couple of years, is changing policy and how the industry has reacted, specifically changing policy pertaining to the industry's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. On this slide, we just listed out the various temporary policies that we saw the agency put forward. And it was really a collaborative effort between the agency and industry to change their policies, be flexible to ensure that patients had access to the drugs that they needed, as well as also make some alterations in policies to ensure that compounding facilities and outsourcing facilities had the supplies that they needed in order to compound during the emergency. And with that, it's really important when preparing for inspections to not only know the standards that apply to you, study any past 483 observations and learn from those, but also just become familiar with the history and follow along with the development and currently dynamic FDA notices and guidance policies that are being put forth on outsourcing facilities. Over the next couple of slides, we've listed all of the FDA notices and guidance documents that have been issued specific to outsourcing facilities since the inception of the outsourcing facility industry. As you know, the DQSA, which created outsourcing facilities, became a law or was enacted in about 2013. And since then, we started seeing these guidance documents and Federal Register notices and requests for comment that the FDA was requesting started to be issued in late 2014 through 2015. They've also issued several guidance documents in 2016 and 2017. Specifically, one to note here is the draft guidance on hospital and health system compounding. That is a guidance document that is anticipated to be updated soon. This just shows that policy and guidance is constantly evolving and adapting to the needs of industry as well as patients. These are the guidance documents that were issued in 2019. And like I mentioned earlier, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA was issuing a lot of temporary policies and guidance documents. So you'll see that we actually have the guidance documents that were issued in 2020 broken up for the first half and second half. And then our current year of 2021, so far there's only been one notice that was issued relating to outsourcing facilities that related to bulk drug substances. But what I want to spend a little time on and highlight is the CDER guidance agenda, guidance documents that are planned for publication in calendar year 2021. It's anticipated that FDA will be issuing updated draft guidance or revised draft guidance documents for both the 503A and the 503B guidance on compounded drug products that are essentially copies of approved drug products. So it is just very important to keep abreast of these changes, and if the current policy changes at all, to know how to adapt your operations to be in compliance with these policies, as we've seen some observations relate to information that's been found in guidance documents. And also, like I just mentioned, the hospital and health system compounding guidance is anticipated to be released before the year end. That guidance was actually recently sent over to the White House for review and approval to publish. The prohibition on wholesaling under Section 503B guidance is a hotly anticipated guidance document. Again, we alluded to this earlier when we were talking about the prohibition on wholesaling under Section 503B, but there are some questions as to different state interpretations on this prohibition, as well as what is the federal interpretation. This is just something to be aware of and watch for the future, as there are some questions as to whether a 503A compounding pharmacy may further dispense a drug that's been compounded by a 503B outsourcing facility, as many view it as being no different than a hospital pharmacy receiving product from a 503B outsourcing facility and then sending that out to patients in the hospital. It's rather similar to the dispensing of a compounded medication. Additionally, one last guidance document that is slated to be released by year end is the guidance on safety considerations for container labels and carton labeling design to minimize medication errors. And we're anticipating we might see some tips in there on labeling, as labeling is one area that we've seen an increase in the amount of 483 observations related to. And now to get into a couple of the best practices of what you can do before an FDA inspection. I mean, really the best practice is just to develop a plan. You need to plan your work and then work your plan. But every company should have a plan documented in an SOP for managing an inspection, whether that's an FDA inspection, a state regulator inspection, a mock inspection, or any type of vendor or auditor comes. You should really, just like everything in the compounding industry, have a written plan, and you should follow that written plan. And in this SOP or plan for managing inspection, it's important to address the key inspectional issues and be consistent with established company policy on the aspects of an inspection that have the greatest impact on the company and its products. And it's likely the aspects of an inspection that will have the greatest impact on the company are the most common observations that Lee went through earlier and provided some real world examples on. So it's a good idea to focus some effort on those 10 observations. And lastly, one way to really assist in developing your inspection SOP is to get a better understanding of what the FDA may look at when it comes to inspect a facility. I'm not sure how many people know this, but the FDA's Investigations Operations Manual, or IOM, is a publicly available document. Specifically, Chapter 5 outlines establishment inspections, and you can find it online. And in Chapter 5, establishment inspections, the FDA outlines its position on what type of records investigators may review, sampling that may be performed during an inspection, as well as when and when not photographs might be taken, and what some possible repercussions of refusing an inspection. So just getting a good idea of what the FDA is looking for and what the FDA follows during an inspection will greatly benefit your facility when preparing for an inspection, and putting some of those items in the inspection SOP is also very beneficial. Some best practices, again, of what should actually be found in the inspection SOP document. Again, it seems simple, but just want to write out everything that should occur during the inspection, and you should have this written down before the inspection, and ideally you should have received a mock inspection to do a dry run and pressure test this inspection SOP. So the first idea of something to include in the inspection SOP is to make sure that whoever is at the front door of your facility, whether that's a security guard, a receptionist, or whoever that may be, that individual should really have a contact list so that they know who within the organization they should contact when an FDA inspector shows up, whether that's announced or unannounced, just so that the company is aware that an FDA inspection will be taking place. And then from there, outlining that they should send a company communication to alert all the employees that the FDA is on site is another good idea, just so everyone is aware that the FDA is there to inspect. 3, we would recommend, like was mentioned earlier, almost a war room, but designating a workspace for the inspectors so that they can have their own area to do their work, as well as the site inspection team should set up that war room so that they can print out any reports and manage any documentation that is needed. For example, if the FDA is requesting any documentation, it's a very good idea to also prepare a copy and keep a log of everything that's been provided to the FDA so that later on, at the end of your inspection or any subsequent communications, you have a trail of every document that the FDA reviewed. It's also a good idea to appoint people from the organization who must be present at all times, and also appoint someone as almost a note taker or a secretary to be walking alongside the FDA inspector to just capture everything that they're saying and maybe also everything that they are writing down. It's another good idea to appoint a leader to be in charge of the inspection and interact or liaise with the FDA, as well as appoint individuals from the organization whose job it is to field requests from the inspectors. They should work with the note takers to gather all of the requested documentation. 6 is a documentation representative should record all the documents that the inspector wants to review and keep a record, like I mentioned earlier. This typically includes the procedures that the manufacturing or compounding uses to perform daily activities, as well as the firm must maintain a copy of any documents provided and marked as copies for firm records. Facilities should also appoint escorts to accompany the inspectors, and keep in mind that the inspectors should not just be roaming around your facilities unaccompanied, even as simple as showing them where they may use the restroom and where they may stop for a lunch break if they're eating lunch during the inspection. You should prepare in advance a presentation of the operations that are regulated by the FDA. For instance, for compounding facilities, having a preset presentation that will cover all the elements of the entire regulated activity process is definitely helpful for anyone that is interacting with the FDA or in charge of the inspection. 9, prepare a site-wide notification to let the employees know when the inspectors have left. Typically, FDA inspections are not wrapped up in one day. So just providing daily updates to employees, you let them know when the FDA became on site, and also letting them know when the inspection has concluded is beneficial to include in your inspection SOP. And lastly, just deciding ahead of time the plan for the involvement of any external consultants or attorneys when necessary is good to have in the inspection SOP. So it's just one less worry that you have on the day of the inspection as to whether you should be calling your consultant or attorney. If you already have that pre-planned, then you can just follow the plan. And in closing, the key points to best prepare before an FDA inspection are to, again, 1, understand what standard your compounding facility is subject to, whether that is the 503A standards and USP 795 and 797, or whether that is current good manufacturing practices that outsourcing facilities comply with. 2, review the FDA manuals and guidance documents to understand what the FDA will be looking for in their perspective. And 3, definitely prepare before your inspection. And at this time in the presentation, we're going to go through our ACPE questions as well as explain the answers. So the first questions for those seeking CE credits: what type of compounder must follow current good manufacturing practices, or CGMPs? And is that the 503A compounding pharmacies, 503B outsourcing facilities, 503C organizations, or doctors' offices who engage in compounding? Number 2, which of the following is a resource to use to prepare for an FDA inspection? Is that the FDA Investigations Operations Manual, the FDA Guidance Documents, your facility's Inspection SOP, or all of the above? And 3, when should you prepare for an inspection? When the FDA contacts your facility, when you receive an FDA Form 483, before an inspection, or after you receive an FDA Warning Letter. And to go through the answers for the ACPE questions, what type of compounder must follow current good manufacturing practices? That is 503B outsourcing facilities. 503A is the section of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that your traditional pharmacy compounders that are regulated by state boards of pharmacy follow, and they are specifically exempted from following current good manufacturing practices. 503C organizations are not a type of compounding entity, and doctors' offices may engage in compounding. However, they are typically held to the same standards as pharmacy compounders under Section 503A. It's a state-regulated activity. And which of the following is a resource to use to prepare for an FDA inspection? I believe we touched on this throughout the presentation, but the FDA Investigations Operations Manual is a publicly available resource, and it outlines what an FDA investigator does, and it's essentially their version of an SOP. Specifically, Chapter 5 will outline establishment inspections, and we would encourage everyone to review that, as well as any FDA guidance documents that might be applicable to your compounding operation, whether you are a 503A compounding pharmacy or a 503B outsourcing facility. There is sure to be FDA guidance documents explaining FDA's current thinking on whatever topic or policy the guidance document is written about. And your facility's inspection SOP, you should definitely prepare that prior to an inspection, and hopefully go through a mock inspection and put the inspection SOP to the test to make sure that your facility is fully prepared for an FDA inspection. So that's why number 2 is all of the above. And number 3, when should you prepare for an FDA inspection? Definitely before your inspection. Typically for domestic facilities, including compounders, the FDA will not contact your facility prior to an inspection. This differs from FDA's inspection of foreign facilities. Typically, foreign facilities are told ahead of time when the FDA will be there, but unfortunately, as a domestic facility, you do not get that courtesy. So there's no time to prepare because they don't contact you beforehand. After you receive the FDA Form 483, as outlined, the FDA Form 483 is the list of observations or the list of alleged observations that the FDA inspector observed that might be objectionable conditions while they were at the facility during the inspection. It is important to respond to that, typically within 15 business days. However, it is too late to prepare for your inspection after you've received an FDA Form 483. You can view the publicly available Form 483s available online on FDA's website. That's a good idea to review those in preparation for your inspection. And after you receive an FDA warning letter, in the process of FDA's enforcement, typically they'll issue a Form 483, and then based on the firm's response, whether it is adequate to remedy any potential objectionable conditions that were observed during the inspection, will determine whether possibly an FDA warning letter is warranted at a later time. But you definitely want to prepare before an inspection.
Excellent. So I guess that wraps us up. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Remember, if you would like ACPE credit for this lecture, click on the link below and register for the class. You won't have to watch the video again, just answer the quiz questions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated on all our latest content.